15 gospel legends you didn't know were gay. For decades, gospel music has been the heartbeat of Black America, a sacred place where voices soared, spirits lifted, and secrets stayed buried. But behind the hallelujahs, the sold-out church concerts, and the angelic voices that define generations, some of the biggest gospel legends carried a truth they could never speak. Not in public, not in church, not even to the people they loved. These were artists who saved souls on Sunday, but spent the rest of the week hiding their own. And today, we're pulling back the curtain on 15 gospel legends you never knew were gay. The stories the industry whispered about, the churches denied, and the world was never supposed to hear. Get ready, because what you're about to learn will change how you hear their music forever. Billy Preston. Billy Preston's life wasn't just a story. It was an American epic, a tale so vast, so emotionally loaded, it refuses to fit neatly under any single label. To the world, he was a hurricane of sound and spirit. The electrifying keyboard prodigy forever known as the Fifth Beatle, a title he earned not through gimmick or publicity, but through sheer, breathtaking talent. When Billy touched a keyboard, it wasn't music, it was revelation. His fingers moved like fire and prayer at the same time, splashing gospel-soaked funk across every melody he touched. He brought soul to Ray Charles's band and psychedelic magic to the Beatles' final years. Every note he played felt alive, powerful, almost holy. But behind the roaring crowds, the Grammys, the #1 hits, the big afro that bounced like it was holding its own electricity, there lived another Billy Preston, a man the world didn't see, a man fighting a private war within himself. Because long before he was trading riffs with rock legends, Billy was a boy raised inside the sacred walls of the Black church. His entire musical DNA was forged in that fire. Shouts, stomps, moans, and thunderous piano runs meant to lift people's souls straight to heaven. Touring as a teenager with Mahalia Jackson didn't just teach him music, it taught him expectation. It carved a blueprint for how he was supposed to live. And that blueprint didn't leave room for the truth he carried. As Billy's career blasted into superstardom, he shined like pure joy on stage, grinning wide, moving with childlike excitement, filling every room with light. But privately, he lived in a key the world wasn't allowed to hear. Because being a gay Black man in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, inside the worlds of rock, soul, R&B, and especially gospel, meant one thing: hide. Every community he belonged to carried its own version of judgment. Rock pretended to be rebellious, but was filled with quiet homophobia. Soul and R&B demanded a performance of masculinity he could never fully embody. And gospel, the foundation of his entire life, would have rejected him outright if he dared speak his truth. For Billy Preston, survival meant compartmentalizing everything he felt, everything he feared, everything he was. He lived between two worlds, the one that adored him, and the one that would have abandoned him if they knew who he really was. And that tension, the brilliance on stage, the loneliness off stage, followed him for the rest of his life. Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Sister Rosetta Tharpe's voice wasn't just powerful, it was elemental. It was thunder wrapped in velvet, a sound that could slam its fist against injustice or soften into a whisper that felt like God leaning in to listen. Her fingers, heavy with glittering rings, raced across her electric guitar with a ferocity that stunned audiences from church pews to smoky nightclubs. Long before the world even dreamed up the words rock and roll, she had already built its foundation. She was the architect of a revolution, a Black woman in a flowing choir robe, shredding a Gibson like it was a weapon forged in heaven. Her stage presence was a sermon and a storm. When she stepped before a crowd, it wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration of raw talent, holy fire, and unshakable spirit. But behind that fearless grin and that roaring guitar was a woman whose truth was far more daring than the music she created. Sister Rosetta Tharpe lived her life with a quiet courage few in her time could even fathom. In an era when such truths were buried, whispered, or erased, She proudly lived as a bisexual woman within her closest circles. Her greatest love, and the most enduring chapter of her personal life, was with fellow gospel singer and touring partner Marie Knight. Together, they were unstoppable. On stage, Marie's rich contralto grounded Rosetta's soaring power, creating a sound that felt like revival and rebellion rolled into one. Off stage, those who truly knew them understood. They weren't just partners in music. They were partners in life. Their love was an open secret in the tight-knit jazz and gospel communities of cities like New York. But even the strongest love can buckle under the weight of a world determined to crush it. Endless touring, constant scrutiny, and the suffocating prejudices of the 1940s and 50s eventually tore them apart. Their breakup, both professional and personal, was a quiet heartbreak hidden behind the spotlight that made them legends. In the years that followed, Rosetta married men. Unions that were part genuine affection, part armor. Like many LGBTQ plus icons of her time, she crafted a public life that allowed her to survive in a world that refused to see her truth. Yet through it all, her music never lied. Every note she bent, every string she bruised, every roar from her guitar carried the weight of a woman who refused to shrink herself. A woman who shaped the future of rock, gospel, and American music, while fighting to live authentically in a world that never made space for her. Her courage was quiet, but her legacy? Deafening. James Cleveland. James Cleveland wasn't just a gospel performer. He was an architect of an entire spiritual universe. A composer who gave shape to a generation's longing, grief, and unshakable faith. With that gravelly, preacher-deep baritone and a thunderous, soul-shaking piano style, he blurred the line between church and concert hall. When he played, the whole room didn't just listen, it rose. He built the Gospel Music Workshop of America, the birthplace of countless gospel legends, and he crafted the Chicago sound, a majestic, choir-driven force that reshaped sacred music forever. His anthems like Peace Be Still and Lord, Help Me to Hold Out weren't songs. They were lifelines. They were prayers set to melody, answers set to rhythm. But behind the man who preached testimony and truth, there lived a silence so heavy it could split a soul in two. In the very community that crowned him the King of Gospel, James Cleveland lived as a gay man in a world where that truth could cost him everything. It was an open secret, known by many, spoken by almost no one. The same black church he empowered with music often carried deeply conservative, deeply homophobic beliefs. And so he carried a quiet, devastating question inside him. How does a man sing about freedom while hiding a piece of himself in the shadows? This dual life was the private cross he bore, a silent, aching countermelody beneath the thunder of his public praise. When he died in 1991 from complications related to AIDS, the shockwave was immediate and brutal. At a time when AIDS was cruelly mislabeled a gay plague, his death became an involuntary confession, a reveal he never chose. In that moment, the King of Gospel lost control of his own story, and the whispers that had trailed him for decades erupted into a painful, national conversation. A conversation about truth, about judgment, and about the church's own sins, ones many had hoped would stay buried forever. Alex Bradford. Alex Bradford didn't just sing gospel. He reimagined it. He dressed it in sequins, crowned it with thunder, and marched it onto the stage like a revelation the world had been too blind to see. He was a storm wrapped in silk, a dazzling force of nature whose very presence challenged everything people thought a gospel artist should be. With a voice that could rattle church rafters or silence a Broadway audience, Bradford wasn't simply a performer. He was a pioneer. He helped build gospel musical theater from the ground up, fusing the electric spirit of Sunday morning with the storytelling fire of the stage. His early shows didn't just entertain. They shocked, delighted, and announced to the world that gospel was no longer confined to pews. It belonged under spotlights, too. Before he ever held a Tony Award in his hands, he was a prodigy from Alabama, preaching, singing, and radiating an intensity people couldn't ignore. When he moved to Chicago, he crashed straight into a booming gospel scene, and his talents exploded. As a writer and arranger, he flourished. He penned more than 300 songs, among them the timeless Too Close to Heaven, and his live performances were the stuff of legend. Bradford didn't enter a stage. He commanded it, sweeping in with explosive energy, with gestures that painted stories in the air, with a charisma that wrapped around every soul in the room. He didn't sing songs, he embodied them. When he performed, the audience didn't watch. They felt. His natural theatricality reached its full power when he teamed up with director Vinette Carroll. Together, they created the groundbreaking musical Your Arms Too Short to Box with God, a fiery retelling of the gospel of Matthew fused with the music of Bradford and his close friend, Reverend James Cleveland. It became a phenomenon, climbing from off-Broadway to a triumphant main stage run that earned Bradford a Tony Award for Best Original Score. He had done the impossible, bringing the ecstatic soul of the Black church to mainstream theater without watering down a single ounce of its power. But maybe the most revolutionary thing about Alex Bradford wasn't his music, it was the way he lived. In an era when conformity was demanded and difference punished, Bradford walked boldly, brilliantly, and unapologetically in his truth. Within his close circles, actors, artists, and gospel singers, he was openly gay. His flamboyant style, sharp wit, and magnetic presence weren't acts. They were him, always him. He refused to split himself into pieces. The same fire that lit up his performances burned through his everyday life. Even as he navigated the silent judgments of a conservative gospel community, he never shrank. Somehow, through talent, charm, and pure authenticity, he carved out a space where he could be both a revered gospel figure and a man living his truth. He wasn't trying to be a symbol, but he became one anyway, a quiet beacon for those who dreamed of living without fear, without hiding, without apology. His death in 1978 from a respiratory illness came far too soon, silencing a voice that still had galaxies left to give. But the world he built, that stage he crafted with sweat, brilliance, and defiant joy, it still stands. Listen to Your Arms Too Short to Box with God, and you can feel him, his spirit, his humor, his theatrical spark, his unshakable faith. Alex Bradford proved that gospel could be grand, loud, proud, and gloriously alive. He showed that spectacle and spirit were never enemies. They were partners, co-conspirators, the heartbeat of a foot-stomping celebration of life. And his greatest legacy is this: the courage to live, love, create, and shine as your whole self, no matter who's watching. Thomas A. Dorsey. Thomas A. Dorsey is remembered as the father of gospel music, but behind that title was a man wrestling with storms the world never fully saw. He wrote songs that felt like they were carved out of heaven itself. Take My Hand, Precious Lord wasn't just a hymn. It was a lifeline for every grieving soul who ever begged God for strength. Dorsey pioneered a sound that rose from the church pews but carried the raw ache of the blues. Holy on the surface, heartbreaking underneath. When you heard his music, you weren't just hearing a melody. You were hearing a man reaching for God with one hand while fighting his own shadows with the other. But behind the applause, behind the church choirs that lifted his songs like scripture, Thomas Dorsey lived a life far more complicated than the world ever allowed him to show. To the public, he was a devoted husband to Nettie, a father, a pillar of faith. Yet inside, he carried desires he could never confess. Biographers and those who knew him quietly hint at a truth he buried deep. Dorsey was a bisexual man living in a time and a church where such a revelation would have cost him everything. So he locked that part of himself away. He prayed over it. He cried over it. And he carried it in silence. Another weight on a heart already scarred by loss, heartbreak, and the relentless burden of his calling. Thomas A. Dorsey's story isn't just the rise of a musical genius who gave gospel its wings. It's the story of a man torn between the sacred and the forbidden, a man whose secrets bled into his music until every note sounded like both a confession and a prayer. His songs endure not only because they are spiritually powerful, but because they were born from a soul that knew longing, conflict, and love in more forms than he ever dared speak aloud. Rance Allen. Rance Allen wasn't just a singer. He was a force of nature, a voice so powerful, so impossibly elastic, it felt like it reached past the choir stands and brushed the gates of heaven itself. With the Rance Allen Group, he built a sound nobody had ever heard before. Gospel soaked in soul, laced with blues, and pushed with the fire of rock. His voice could roar like thunder shaking a church roof, and then rise into a soft, trembling falsetto that felt like a prayer whispered directly into your chest. To thousands, Rance wasn't merely performing gospel music. He was gospel, flesh and bone wrapped around a sound that felt divine. And for more than 40 years, Bishop Allen stood beside his wife, Jean, his anchor, his partner, the quiet strength behind his whirlwind life of tours, sermons, and songs. But what the world didn't see was the private weight he carried, a truth that clung to his spirit like a shadow he could never outrun. In his later years, Rance did something almost unheard of in the gospel world. He told the truth about his lifelong struggle with same-sex attraction, a battle that many whispered about behind closed doors, but almost no one dared to admit out loud. By speaking it, he cracked open a silence that had held generations captive. He exposed the raw, painful tug-of-war between faith and desire, between the image the pulpit demanded and the reality the heart refused to hide. His confession didn't diminish his legacy, it deepened it. It revealed a man of towering faith who was also deeply human, a man who wrestled with himself as fiercely as he wrestled with every note he sang. In the end, Rance Allen didn't just leave behind groundbreaking music. He left behind a testament, a reminder of the courage it takes to stand in your truth, even when that truth is stitched with pain, contradiction, and the kind of honesty that shakes a room quiet. Walter Hawkins. Walter Hawkins wasn't just a gospel singer. He was a man whose voice felt like it had one foot on earth and the other already stepping into eternity. When he sang "Go Up Yonder," it didn't sound like a song. It sounded like a doorway, a promise that somewhere beyond heartbreak, beyond grief, heaven was waiting with open arms. With that smooth, effortless voice and those radiant compositions, Walter helped define an entire era of gospel. His choirs didn't just harmonize, they soared, as if they were warming up for the gates of glory themselves. To hear Walter was to feel something shift inside you, comfort, conviction, and the overwhelming sense that God was closer than the air you breathed. His marriage to the brilliant Tremaine Hawkins was once the crown jewel of gospel. Two icons, two titans, a union so dazzling it seemed like it had been written in Scripture itself. But behind the polished photographs and the award show smiles lived a truth that insiders whispered about but never dared to say out loud. Walter Hawkins was a gay man. The wider church would never acknowledge it, and Walter himself carried that truth like a storm trapped beneath his ribs. It was a painful collision of faith and identity, of a gospel he preached to millions and a personal longing he could not pray away. This wasn't a simple struggle. It was an internal war, silent but brutal, one that left no visible wounds yet shaped every note he ever sang. You could hear the battle in his voice, the yearning, the ache, the kind of longing that doesn't come from heartbreak alone, but from a life lived balancing devotion with secrecy, joy with quiet sorrow. And yet, from that tension came brilliance. Walter created music that refuses to die, songs that still lift the weary, strengthen the broken, and offer hope to those standing in the dark looking for a way out. His legacy is deeper than awards and chart-topping records. Walter Hawkins remains a legend because he embraced the light and the shadow within him, and somehow turned both into beauty. He reminds us of a truth we forget too easily. Even saints struggle, even the holy wrestle. And sometimes their greatest gifts are born from that very fight. Tremaine Hawkins. Tremaine Hawkins was never just a singer, she was a storm. A voice so powerful it could shake the walls of a sanctuary. yet so tender it could slip straight into the human soul. From her early days with the Edwin Hawkins Singers to the heights of her solo career, Tramaine didn't just perform gospel, she expanded it. She sang with the conviction of a pastor, the fire of a revival tent, and the shine of a superstar who knew her gift could not be contained. When she released Fall Down, the entire gospel world trembled. The song crossed over, broke barriers, and proved once and for all that Tramaine Hawkins belonged to no single genre, no single audience, no single tradition. Listening to her was like feeling holy fire and heartbreaking intimacy at the same time, a rare, unforgettable mix. Her marriage to Walter Hawkins once looked like a divine pairing, gospel's golden couple destined to carry the kingdom side by side. But behind the stained glass windows, in the quiet corners where church folk whisper, their story was far more complicated. Those close to them have murmured for years that Tramaine, like Walter, was navigating her own truth, that her heart leaned toward women. Unlike Walter, she has never spoken on the rumors, never confirmed, never denied. She simply locked her private life away and poured everything she had into ministry, music, and survival. What is undeniable is this: Tramaine's life, just like her voice, has been shaped by triumph and tension, by the heavy expectations of a world that often forces silence on anyone who loves differently. Through it all, she chose a simple response. Let the music speak louder than the speculation. And it did. Her voice continues to lift worship services, concert halls, and weary hearts everywhere. Tramaine Hawkins remains a legend, not just because of her unmatched talent, but because of the grace, resilience, and quiet strength she carried through decades of scrutiny. Whatever truth she has held close to her chest, her voice reveals everything: love, struggle, faith, passion, and the courage to rise above it all and become something transcendent. Yvette Flunder. Yvette Flunder was never just a gospel singer. She became the living, breathing definition of the gospel itself. Wide enough, fierce enough, and compassionate enough to hold every soul the church tried to push out. Before she was a bishop, before she was a revolutionary, she was a young vocalist in the Walter Hawkins Singers, her voice carrying that warm, unmistakable Golden Hawkins fire. But while others stayed silent to survive, Flunder chose a different path. She chose truth. She stepped forward not only as an artist, but as a pastor, bold, unapologetic, and determined to prove that God's love had never been limited. In a world that demanded secrecy, she dared to be openly lesbian, a walking contradiction to the rules meant to contain her. While many hid their identities in the shadows to protect themselves, Flunder placed hers on the altar for everyone to see. Unashamed, unmovable. In Oakland, she built something the gospel world had never seen: the City of Refuge United Church of Christ, a safe haven for the rejected, the wounded, the forgotten, and the silenced. Her ministry became an act of holy rebellion, a declaration that queer bodies and queer love were not outside of God's grace, but the very heart of God's kingdom. Her story is woven into the Hawkins legacy, yet it stands entirely on its own. Where Walter Hawkins battled his struggles quietly, Yvette turned hers into testimony, using her voice in both song and sermon to prove that faith and authenticity are not enemies, but partners. She is one of the rare figures in gospel history who refused to sacrifice honesty for acceptance. And because of that, she has become a lighthouse for LGBTQ plus believers, and for anyone who has ever been cast aside in the name of religion. Yvette Flunder's legacy is still being written, but it already echoes with a prophetic power. She reminds us that gospel music was born from the cries of the oppressed, from people yearning for freedom, and she carried that spirit straight into her ministry. Her life is a hymn of defiance, a hymn of belonging, a reminder that the truest form of worship is daring to live your truth out loud. Sandra Crouch. Sandra Crouch spent her life standing beside a giant, her legendary twin brother, Andre Crouch. But don't be mistaken, she was never anyone's shadow. Sandra was a quiet storm in gospel music, a Grammy-winning artist, a master percussionist whose hands commanded choirs like armies of angels, and a vocalist whose tone could disappear into a harmony or rise above it with unshakable authority. Together, the Crouch twins helped drag gospel into the modern era. Their songs reached people who never set foot in a church, yet still felt something sacred stirring in their souls. And through it all, Sandra remained steady, humble, and deeply anointed, the kind of brilliance that doesn't chase the spotlight, but makes everyone standing in it shine brighter. But behind the music, Sandra lived a life wrapped in silence. She never married. She never revealed her most personal truths. In a church world where judgment could be swift and merciless, Sandra used privacy as both armor and sanctuary. Only after her passing did those closest to her begin to whisper what she never said aloud. Sandra Crouch was a lesbian. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a secret born of shame. It was a truth she carried quietly, gently, protecting herself and the ministry she had poured her entire life into. Her silence was not emptiness. It was sacrifice, a choice made in the painful space between devotion and authenticity, between the woman she was and the world she served through song. Yet even in that silence, Sandra left a powerful testimony. Her rhythms, her voice, her unwavering loyalty to Andre and to their shared mission. All of it revealing a woman who gave gospel music immeasurable treasures. Even as the church demanded she tuck away a part of her own soul. Sandra Crouch's legacy is not simple. It is layered, brave, and profoundly human. She was a musical genius, a faithful servant, and a woman who carried a hidden truth with quiet, unbreakable strength. And her life reminds us of something the church rarely admits. Behind the hallelujahs are hearts that bleed. Behind the harmonies are stories never told. Stories of love, stories of longing, stories carried in silence. And though Sandra never spoke her truth out loud, it was real, it mattered, and her impact on gospel will echo forever. Andre Crouch. Andre Crouch wasn't just a gospel singer. He was a force of nature, a man who bent the entire genre into something new, something bigger, something the world had never heard before. They called him the father of modern gospel, and they meant it. Andre dragged the sound of Sunday morning out of church pews and into pop radio, movie theaters, and living rooms across the globe. People who had never opened a Bible found themselves in tears because of his music. That was his power. With 7 Grammys, chart-topping songs, and collaborations that stretched from Michael Jackson to Madonna, his influence was so deep that even secular music couldn't escape it. No matter how far his music traveled, no matter how bright the spotlight burned, his melodies always carried a whisper of the sacred, like a prayer sewn into every note. He was the bridge between heaven and Hollywood, and gospel walked across it because of him. But behind the applause, behind the genius, behind the millions of lives he touched, lived a silence he never broke. Andre never married. He never spoke publicly about his romantic life. For decades, quiet whispers followed him. Whispers that those closest to him would later confirm. Andre Crouch was a gay man, living in a world where his truth could cost him everything. He carried that reality alone, tucked behind a pulpit of expectations, trapped between the identity he felt and the identity the church demanded. That tension, it shaped him. It haunted him. It lived inside every song. Maybe that's why his music hits so hard. Why it aches. Why it lifts you up and breaks your heart at the same time. His songs sound like both victory and confession. Like he poured in a melody the words he was never allowed to speak. A man who trusted God completely, yet carried burdens he could only express through a keyboard and a microphone. Still, he gave the world joy. He gave the church new anthems. He gave gospel a new language, one honest enough to be human and bold enough to reach heaven. Andre Crouch remains one of gospel's greatest giants, not just for the heights he reached, but for the storms he survived. His story is brilliance wrapped in pain, faith tangled with secrecy, a life spent bringing millions closer to God while wrestling with his own truth in silence. His legacy is the sound of gospel reborn, and a reminder that even the most anointed among us bleed, yearn, struggle, and love just like everyone else. He was gifted. He was burdened. He was human, beautifully, painfully human. Donald Vales. Donald Vales could pull sound out of a choir the way a painter pulls light out of darkness. He wasn't just a director, a pianist, or a producer. He was an architect of emotion, a man whose hands could take an ordinary choir and turn it into a living, breathing river of harmony. From his early days with the Caravans to collaborations that reached all the way to Stevie Wonder, Vales built a career that proved his genius was not an accident. It was destiny. Under his direction, singers didn't just learn music, they learned purpose. Musicians didn't just rehearse. They stepped into a sacred classroom where discipline, passion, and calling collided. In the world of gospel workshops, Donald Vales stood like a giant, guiding, shaping, elevating. His choirs didn't perform, they ignited. But behind the standing ovations and the thunderous choirs, there lived a truth the gospel world was never ready to face. Donald Vales was a gay man, and he lived in an era when that truth wasn't just taboo, it was dangerous. The 1980s and early 90s were a time of whispered rumors, of silence weaponized by shame, and of a devastating AIDS crisis that took far too many voices before they were heard. When Donald Vales died in 1992 from AIDS-related illness, the gospel community mourned the brilliance they had lost, but many avoided acknowledging the man he truly was. Public tributes praised the musician, the visionary, the teacher. But those who loved him privately knew the fuller story. A man who loved deeply, quietly, and authentically in a world that demanded he hide. His sexuality never dimmed his genius. His illness never erased his legacy. If anything, the fact that he created such breathtaking beauty in a world that tried to silence him makes his story even more powerful. Donald Vales is a reminder of the voices the church has lifted up on Sunday morning, while pushing into the shadows the rest of the week. Yet his sound still lives. In the choirs he trained, in the directors he mentored, in the harmonies that still shimmer through sanctuaries when his arrangements are sung. He left behind fire. He left behind truth. He left behind a legacy that refuses to be buried. Donald Vales deserves to stand, not in silence, but in the full, thunderous chorus of gospel history. Bessie Griffin. Bessie Griffin wasn't just a singer. She was a force of nature. When she opened her mouth, the room didn't just listen, it submitted. Her voice didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. Born from the sacred fire of New Orleans gospel, she learned early that church wasn't a place you visited. It was a place that lived inside you. And by the time she joined the gospel caravans, Bessie could take a lyric and make it feel like both a whispered prayer and a thunderstorm breaking open the sky. People didn't admire her only for the notes she could reach. They admired her for the way she emptied herself into every song. When Bessie sang, it felt like she was exhaling a truth she couldn't say out loud, as if music was the only space big enough for her spirit to breathe. But behind that mighty voice was a life far more complicated than the pews and polished shoes of Sunday morning could ever hold. In gospel circles, her name traveled with whispers, quiet stories about the women she loved, spoken only in hallways, late-night phone calls, and knowing glances between people who understood exactly what such truths could cost. Because in the church of her era, where salvation and respectability were stitched tightly together, there was no room for a woman to stand boldly as both a gospel star and a woman who loved women. So Bessie lived in that small, painful space between who she was and who the world demanded she pretend to be. She poured her whole heart onto the stage while hiding parts of herself everywhere else. Her music became her refuge, a sanctuary where her voice could confess what her life could not. Every performance felt like she was wrestling with God right in front of you, turning longing, fear, desire, and truth into pure sound. Maybe that's why people still speak her name with such reverence. Because you didn't just hear Bessie Griffin. You felt her. You felt the weight, the struggle, the faith, the fight. Her story is a reminder of how many gospel legends had to survive the collision between identity and expectation, between their calling and their truth. Bessie never stepped on stage and announced who she was. She never had that luxury, but the people who loved her knew. And if you listen close, really close, you can still hear it in her recordings. A woman who gave every inch of her soul to gospel music, even when she could not give her whole self to the world. Wilmer Little Axe Broadnax. Wilmer Little Axe Broadnax wasn't just a singer. He was a force. The kind of voice that didn't just rise above a quartet. It lifted the entire church. His razor-sharp tenor cut through harmonies like lightning, urgent and burning with conviction. One note from him could send a Sunday night congregation into a holy frenzy or calm a broken spirit hanging on by a thread. He sang with the Giants, the Spirit of Memphis, the Five Blind Boys of Mississippi, later the Five Blind Boys of Alabama. And every time Little Axe stepped to the mic, you knew it. His sound was unforgettable. He was the heartbeat of quartet gospel, a small man with a mighty presence, carrying a gift that felt carved from the soul of the black church itself. But Little Axe carried something else too, something heavier than fame, heavier than applause. He lived his entire life as a man in an era and inside a church where the very idea of gender identity simply did not exist. To his fellow singers, he was always Brother Broadnax, a respected, admired pillar of the quartet world. No one questioned him. No one doubted him. He moved through a male-dominated tradition with complete authority, matched by no one. Yet his deepest truth lived quietly beneath the surface. Little Axe was transgender long before the word had any place in the black church, long before society had the language or compassion to understand it. And he carried that truth with strength, dignity, and an unshakable sense of self. When he died in 1992, the world learned what he himself had never spoken. He had been assigned female at birth. The revelation sent shockwaves through gospel circles, not because it diminished him, but because it forced people to confront just how fully, how boldly he had lived as himself in a world that would have never allowed it openly. The same power that made his voice soar had carried him through a lifetime of quiet defiance, courage, and authenticity. Wilmer Little Axe Broadnax is not a footnote in gospel history. His life is a testimony, a reminder that the people who built gospel with their bare hands and raw voices live stories far more complicated, brave, and beautiful than the church was ever willing to admit. His voice still echoes on those old records, ringing clear, fierce, and unforgettable proof that truth, like gospel itself, can never be silenced. Carl Bean. Carl Bean's story didn't begin in rebellion. It began in the trembling heartbeat of gospel music. In the packed pews of Baltimore, where Sunday morning choirs could shake the walls, young Carl's voice rose like a promise. For a while, he walked the well-worn path of every gospel prodigy, belting out hymns to congregations that shouted, danced, and swayed under the weight of his talent. But destiny had other plans. Carl Bean was never meant to stay inside the narrow lines the church drew for him. His calling would be louder, braver, and far more dangerous than any gospel stage could contain. Then came the 1970s, with one thunderous anthem, "I Was Born This Way." Carl stepped into the mainstream and lit a fire that could not be extinguished. The song wasn't just disco. It wasn't just music. It was a declaration, a bold, unapologetic shout for every LGBTQ person who had been shamed into silence. While others hid, Carl stood in the spotlight and told the world exactly who he was. For him, it wasn't a hit record. It was testimony. In a gospel world where so many queer voices survive by whispering, Carl refused to lower his volume. His music became a ministry long before he built a church, a healing pulse that moved from crowded dance floors straight into hearts that had waited a lifetime to hear someone say, "You are not wrong for existing." But Carl Bean's greatest revolution came later. He founded the Unity Fellowship Church, a spiritual home for every believer the traditional church had cast aside. For the first time, LGBTQ Christians had a place where their faith and identity didn't have to fight each other. They could pray, praise, cry, love, and breathe without fear. As Bishop Bean poured his soul into this ministry, offering a hand to people who'd been told God wanted nothing to do with them, his message became radical precisely because it was tender. Carl lived openly gay. He preached openly gay. He ministered openly gay, not in secret, not in shame, but in the full light of day. In a world that demanded silence, Carl Bean shouted. His legacy isn't just in the church he built or the song that became an anthem. It lives in the countless souls who finally saw themselves reflected in a man of God. For every queer gospel singer who hid their truth, Carl became their voice. For every church kid who tried to pray away feelings they didn't have words for, Carl became their balm. He embodied a truth gospel music has always known deep down. God's love is bigger than fear, bigger than rules, and wide enough to hold us all.